The message arrived 17 seconds before the assembly vote, and it changed nothing. That was the part Ambassador Reyes could not forgive. 17 seconds. A human survey crew, 6 people, gone silent in a system the Concorde itself had marked as disputed but unpatrolled. 17 seconds of warning and the vote passed anyway. Incident deemed unworthy of formal investigation. 91 votes for, 4 against. 1 silent abstention, cast by the single chair reserved for Earth. Reyes sat in that chair now, hands flat on the cool obsidian table, listening to the assembly move on to trade tariffs on helium-3, as if 6 human lives had simply been filed and closed. Around him, delegates in silk robes and crystalline exoskeletons and rippling luminous membranes continued their business in a dozen translated tongues. None of them looked at him. That, too, was a kind of verdict. 200 years since first contact. 200 years of treaties signed with trembling gratitude, of colonies capped at a modest handful of systems, of a fleet leashed to patrol boundaries and never cross them, of a species graded, tested, and found provisional. Too young, too violent, too unpredictable to be trusted with a real vote, a real voice, a real future among the stars they had once dreamed, as children, of reaching. Reyes had spent 30 years being patient. Patience, he was beginning to understand, was simply another word for permission granted to everyone except yourself. He rose from his chair. The chamber's ambient hum did not pause for him, but a few eyes turned, curious, mildly amused, the way one might glance at a pet that had suddenly stood on its hind legs. "A crew is missing," Reyes said, and his voice, amplified by the translation lattice, filled the chamber in 40 languages at once. 6 human beings, not soldiers, surveyors, cartographers, people who map stars for a living, and you have decided their disappearance does not merit 15 minutes of your attention. The chief arbiter, a tall being of shifting violet light known as Sir Ilvath, inclined what might have been a head. "Ambassador Reyes, the system in question lies within a contested boundary. Concorde Protocol does not obligate investigation of incidents in unpatrolled zones, regardless of the species involved." "They were human," Reyes said. "That is the only fact that matters to me." "Then investigate it yourselves," Ilvath said, not unkindly, and that was somehow worse than cruelty. "Within the bounds of your treaty, of course." Reyes did not shout. He had learned across 3 decades that shouting only confirmed what they already believed about his species. Instead, he said very quietly, "We will," and sat back down. And for the first time in 30 years, he meant it as something other than a diplomatic formality. 9 light-years away, Commander Elena Voss was already breaking that treaty. She sat in the cockpit of the Meridian's Echo, a fast recon vessel technically registered for border patrol and nothing else, watching the nav display paint a boundary line across the void. A line she was about to cross without authorization, without backup, and without anything resembling a plan beyond find them. Voss had flown search patterns before. She knew the statistics. A crew silent for 6 days in deep space was, by every reasonable measure, a crew that was already dead. But 2 of the 6 names on that manifest belonged to people she had trained with at the academy: Kowalski, who used to sneak coffee into simulator runs, and Aditi Rao, who had once talked Voss through a panic attack at 300 hours over a comm channel neither of them ever mentioned again. Reasonable measures did not apply to people you knew by the sound of their laugh. "Command is going to ground you for a year," said her XO, Lieutenant Osi, from the seat beside her. He didn't sound like he disagreed with what she was doing. He sounded like a man saying a true thing out loud so someone else would have said it first. "Command can ground me after," Voss said. The boundary line slid past the viewport, invisible except as a number changing on a screen, and nothing happened. No alarms, no interceptors. Just the quiet, ordinary vastness of space, indifferent to treaties. They flew for 6 hours before the sensors caught anything at all, and when they did, Voss felt the hair rise on her arms before her conscious mind understood why. It was a graveyard, not a battlefield, not a natural formation, a graveyard, Dozens of derelict hulls drifting in a loose, silent cluster, their metal skins scarred and pitted, some sheared clean in half as if some enormous hand had simply torn them apart. Voss brought the ship in slow, running passive scans, her pulse loud in her own ears. "Osei, tell me those are conquered ships." Osei's hands moved fast over his console and the color drained slowly out of his voice as he answered. "They're not." "Elena, I don't have a match. Hull composition's human-grade alloy, but the design signatures aren't in any registry. Not ours. Not anyone's." "That's not possible. We've only had spaceflight for—" "I know how long we've had spaceflight," Osei snapped, then caught himself, quieter. "I know." Voss stared through the viewport at the drifting wreckage, at ships built from human metal in shapes humanity had never built, and felt something cold settle low in her stomach. Not fear exactly, but its close and older cousin, the feeling of standing at the edge of something too large to see the shape of. Then the comm panel lit up. It wasn't the missing crew's frequency. It wasn't any frequency Voss recognized from current fleet protocols at all. It took her 3 full seconds to place it, and when she did, her blood went genuinely cold. "That's a Terran military cipher," she said. "Osei, that's a decommissioned cipher. That encryption format was retired, 110 years ago? 120? Before the war that unified the continental fleets. Nobody uses that anymore. Nobody's used that in living memory." "Then somebody just started using it again," Osei said, "because it's transmitting right now. And Elena—" He swallowed. "It's not random noise. It's structured. It's a countdown." Voss leaned toward the display, watching numbers fall in a code her ship's systems shouldn't have even been able to translate, and yet somehow did, smooth and immediate, as though some old instinct in the Meridian's echo itself already knew this language. 94, 93, 92. "Get me a lock on the source," Voss said, her voice steady even as her hands were not. "Whatever's counting down out there, I want to know what happens when it hits 0. The numbers kept falling, patient and ancient and utterly impossible, drifting out from a graveyard of ships that history said had never existed, broadcasting a language humanity had supposedly buried over a century ago. And somewhere in that dead cipher, buried in its rhythm like a second signal hidden inside the first, was something that made every hair on Voss's body stand on end. A pulse, faint and steady, that sounded less like a machine counting down to detonation, and more, impossibly, like something counting down to waking up. The countdown hit 0, and nothing exploded. Something opened instead. Voss watched on the sensor display as one of the derelict hulls, the largest in the cluster, half again the size of the Meridian's echo, shuddered along its spine, and a seam of pale light split its hull like an eye opening after a very long sleep. No weapons fired, no debris scattered, just light, spilling slow and steady into vacuum, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, a heartbeat on the bioscanner. "There's someone alive in there," Osei said, disbelieving. "Get us alongside," Voss said. "Suits now." The interior of the derelict was colder than the void outside, which shouldn't have been possible, and Voss tried not to think too hard about what that meant. Her suit light swept across corridors, built its strange, almost familiar proportions, human enough that her body's instincts read them as safe, alien enough that every few meters something in the architecture made her skin crawl. Symbols lined the walls, geometric and layered, not quite any alphabet she recognized. And yet, disturbingly, some small unlanguaged part of her brain kept trying to read them anyway, the way you might catch yourself sounding out a word in a language you were certain you'd never learned. They found her in what looked like a stasis chamber near the ship's core. Dr. Amara Chen, xenoarchaeologist, one of the 6 missing surveyors, alive but barely. Dehydrated, shaking, her eyes raw from crying or from something worse. When she saw Voss's insignia through the visor, she didn't scream or sob with relief. She grabbed Voss's arm with a grip like iron and said, in a voice scraped down to a whisper, "You have to leave. Right now. They know I found it. They'll come for the ship." "Who's they? Where's the rest of your crew?" Chen's face crumpled just for a moment, and Voss understood before the words came that the answer was the worst one. Gone. 2 days ago. Something took the ship apart looking for. She stopped herself visibly, deliberately, as though some old training had kicked in even through her terror. I have to show you something first, before they get here. You need to see it, or nobody will ever believe what happened. She led them, stumbling, refusing help, deeper into the derelict, to a chamber where the walls were less corroded, better preserved, and covered floor to ceiling in the same layered symbols. At the center of one wall was a single glyph, larger than the rest, carved instead of etched, as if it had been placed there by hand rather than machine. I've spent 12 years excavating pre-conquered ruins on Earth, Chen said. Sites older than written history. There's a marking that shows up at 4 of them, always alone, always deliberately hidden, like someone wanted it protected rather than displayed. She raised a trembling hand toward the glyph on the wall. That's it. That exact symbol. On a ship built centuries before humanity supposedly reached orbit. Voss stared at the glyph, and the strange, unlanguaged part of her mind that had been quietly straining this whole time finally gave way. A word surfaced in her thoughts, whole and certain, the way a name surfaces when you see an old friend's face, not translated, not decoded, simply known. She didn't understand it, but she recognized the shape of it the way you recognize your own handwriting. Chen. Voss's voice came out unsteady. What does it say? Chen looked at her sharply, some new fear entering her expression that had nothing to do with the derelict ship around them. You can read it? Before Voss could answer, Osi's voice cracked across the comm from the airlock. Elena, company. Multiple contacts coming in fast and their transponders aren't Concord standard. I'm reading them as warden registry. Chen's face went white. They found us. Overseer Cale Thren watched the derelict cluster grow on his tactical display with the flat, contained patience of a man who had been managing this particular problem for a very long time. He was not technically supposed to exist, not as anything so crude as a soldier or an assassin. The wardens were, on paper, a Concord oversight division tasked with securing decommissioned technology from contested zones. In practice, Thren answered to no Concord vote, filed no reports that survived independent audit, and had spent the last 11 years of his long life ensuring that certain wreckage fields remained undiscovered, unexamined, and eventually unrecoverable. This was the 3rd time humans had stumbled into this particular graveyard. The first 2 times the problem had been contained quietly, efficiently, without incident reaching any assembly floor. Thren did not intend to let a 3rd mistake become a habit. Commander Voss has a survivor with her, reported his second, a narrow-eyed operative named Ryzek. Dr. Chen, she's already accessed the primary archive chamber. Then she's already seen more than she should have. Thren's voice remained level, unhurried. Disable their ship. I want them contained, not destroyed, and we've made that mistake before, and dead humans generate more attention than live ones we control. Recover whatever Chen has documented, all of it. And the wreckage field itself? Thren studied the derelict cluster a moment longer. The strange, proud lines of ships that should not exist, built by a people who did not remember building them. Waiting silently across the dark for someone to finally ask the right question, he had read the classified histories. He knew in outline, if not in full, precisely what humanity had once been, and precisely why the Concord's oldest architects had judged it safer for humanity to forget. Prep the field for full disposal, Thren said. After we take what we need. This ends here. Inside the derelict, Voss's suit alarms began screaming half a second before the hull shook around them, warden breaching charges fast and brutal, tearing entry points along the outer plating. Osi's voice came through fractured with static. They're inside. Multiple boarding parties, they're not talking, they're just moving. Elena, we need to go now. Chen grabbed Voss's wrist again, and this time her grip wasn't fear. It was urgency, purpose, the desperate clarity of someone who had already decided what mattered most. The word, she said, fast, breathless, as boots pounded somewhere down the corridor behind them. You read it. I need you to tell me what it says because I think it's not a warning. I think it's a name. Voss looked back once at the glyph on the wall, glowing faint under her suit light, and the word rose up in her again, whole and certain and impossible. She opened her mouth to say it aloud. The corridor lights died. Every one of them at once, plunging the chamber into total black. And in the sudden dark, Voss heard warden boots closing from both directions, heard Chen's breath catch beside her, and felt, for one disorienting heartbeat, the strange, absolute certainty that whatever that word meant, she had known it her entire life without ever knowing she knew it at all. The dark didn't last. Voss made sure of that. She'd trained for exactly this: total sensory blackout, hostiles closing from two directions, zero visibility, because human combat doctrine had never had the luxury of superior technology to fall back on. Where the warden's entire approach assumed sensors, shields, and certainty, human tactics had been built for centuries around a much simpler premise. Sometimes you have nothing but your wits and the person next to you, and it has to be enough. Chen down now, Voss whispered, and yanked the archaeologist flat against the deck a half-second before she popped a flare canister sideways down the corridor, not toward the wardens, but past them, so that when it ignited, their own suit optics, calibrated for low light, flared blind for the 2 seconds Voss needed. She moved through those 2 seconds like the corridor belonged to her. A boarding trooper went down hard, disarmed before he understood he'd been touched. A second stumbled into her elbow in the chaos and folded. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't supposed to be. It was fast, ugly, and utterly unpredictable to soldiers whose entire tactical education assumed an enemy who fought with equipment, not improvisation. Move! Voss hauled Chen up and shoved her toward the breach point Osei was fighting to keep open, and behind them she heard warden voices, sharp with something Voss hadn't expected to hear from them. Confusion. They hadn't planned for this. Nobody plans for an opponent willing to fight without the numbers on their side. They made it back to the Meridian's echo with seconds to spare, Osei already spooling the engines before the airlock finished cycling. Warden ships gave chase, faster on paper, better armed on every spec sheet Voss had ever seen, and still the Echo slipped through the wreckage field on a route no clean nav computer would have chosen, threading gaps between derelict hulls too narrow for anything but a pilot willing to trust her own hands over her instruments. It shouldn't have worked. It worked anyway, and somewhere behind them Voss imagined Thren recalculating everything he thought he understood about what humans were capable of. The footage from Chen's suit camera reached Earth 11 hours later, and Ambassador Reyes watched it 4 times before he trusted himself to move. Armed warden operatives, breaching an unregistered civilian archaeological site, firing on a decorated Terran officer without provocation or authorization. It was, by any reasonable Concord standard, an act of war dressed up as routine enforcement, and Reyes intended to make sure every delegate in the assembly saw it exactly that way. He requested an emergency session. It was granted, reluctantly, and Reyes stood in the chamber where he had once absorbed indifference in silence and played the footage for the entire assembly without a word of introduction. The silence afterward was different from the silence before. Reyes had spent 30 years learning to read alien body language, and what he saw now, the shifting discomfort of a dozen species, the sudden refusal of several delegates to meet his eyes, told him the tide, for the first time, had genuinely moved. The Warden Division acted without assembly authorization, Reyes said, in contested space, against a conquered member species, without cause. I want to know who gave that order, and I want to know why an oversight division answerable to no one has apparently been operating in secrecy for years. Ser Ilvath, for once, did not have an immediate answer. The matter will be investigated. It will be investigated publicly, Reyes said. Or humanity will conduct its own investigation, in its own space, with its own fleet, and you may decide for yourselves whether that's a precedent you want to encourage. It was technically a threat. It was also, Reyes noted with something like grim satisfaction, the first threat any human diplomat had made in the Assembly's recorded history that hadn't been immediately dismissed. Several delegates were already conferring quietly among themselves, and for once, they were not laughing. But Thren was not finished, and Reyes hadn't yet seen the counter-move coming. Within the day, a competing narrative reached the assembly floor through warden-aligned channels. The human vessel had trespassed in contested space, provoked a lawful enforcement action, and falsified footage to cast legitimate Concord operatives as aggressors. It was a lie built with just enough truth in it to be difficult to fully dismantle. Voss had crossed the boundary without authorization, and Thren used it with surgical precision. The vote that followed was not the vote Reyes had hoped for. Rather than censuring the wardens, the Assembly moved to suspend Earth's remaining Concord privileges pending review of the border violation, effectively placing humanity under quarantine, cutting off trade, travel, and communication beyond the treaty's narrowest terms. Reyes stood in the chamber, watching 2 centuries of patient diplomacy collapse into isolation in a single vote, and understood with sudden clarity that patience had never been the thing keeping humanity safe. It had only ever been the thing keeping humanity contained. Aboard the Meridian's Echo, now officially a rogue vessel with no legal standing anywhere in conquered space, Voss received the quarantine order in silence and did not turn the ship around. "They're going to court-martial you," Osei said quietly. "Both of us, probably. And now the entire planet's locked down because of it." "I know. And you're still not stopping." Voss looked at Chen, who had spent the last 6 hours barely speaking, poring over the fragments of data she'd managed to pull from the derelict's archive before the breach. Fragments that piece by piece were starting to assemble into something Voss didn't yet have words for. "Chen," Voss said, "tell me what you found." Chen turned the display toward her, hands trembling slightly, not from fear this time. A location. Coordinates buried inside the archive's deepest layer, encoded the same way as everything else on that ship. A language I shouldn't be able to read, and somehow can anyway. She swallowed. "It's not out there in contested space, Elena. It's in our own solar system. The asteroid belt, sealed, shielded, built with a level of technology nobody on Earth has ever officially possessed, and definitely nothing our ancestors could have built, not with what history says they had." Voss felt the same cold certainty she'd felt staring at the glyph on the derelict's wall. The sense of standing at the edge of something vast, older than everything she'd been taught to believe about her own species. "Set a course," she said. It took them 4 days to reach the coordinates, threading past patrol lines that, thanks to the quarantine, were now watching for exactly one ship. Theirs. They found the vault exactly where Chen's data said it would be. An asteroid indistinguishable from 1,000 others, until Voss's sensors caught the telltale symmetry buried beneath its surface, a structure too perfect, too deliberate to be anything natural. They cut through the outer rock in silence, suits sealed, weapons ready for wardens that hadn't caught up yet but surely would. Beneath the stone was a door, smooth, seamless, marked with the same layered glyphs from the derelict ship, larger here, more deliberate, as though whoever built it had wanted absolute certainty that it would never open by accident. Voss raised her hand toward the door's central panel, not entirely sure what she expected to happen. The vault did not need force. It did not need a code, a key, or an override. The moment Voss's palm touched the smooth surface, light flooded up through the seams of the door in slow, deliberate pulses, and a voice, calm, ancient, unmistakably shaped by some long-dead human throat, spoke a single word into her suitcom, a word that hung in the vacuum around her like a held breath. It was her name, not Elena Voss. A different name entirely, older, heavier, spoken with the unmistakable warmth of someone who had been waiting, for a very long time, for exactly this moment to finally arrive. The name hung in Voss's ears long after the vault door finished opening, and she still hadn't found the breath to ask it to repeat itself. "Elena." Chen's voice, tight with something between awe and dread, pulled her back. "Elena, look." Beyond the door was not the dark, ruined interior Voss had braced for. Light rose gently along the walls as they entered, responding to their presence the way the door had. Not activated but woken, as though the vault itself had simply been dreaming, and was now, gently, opening its eyes. The chamber beyond was vast, circular, lined with towers of dark crystalline material that hummed faintly at the edge of hearing, and at its center stood a single console, untouched by dust or time in a way that should have been impossible after however many centuries this place had waited. "This isn't conquered architecture," Chen breathed, moving slowly, reverently between the towers. "This isn't anyone's architecture I've ever catalogued. It's, Elena, it's older than the conquered, older than the oldest ruins I've excavated on Earth, and those already predate written human history by thousands of years." Voss approached the console, and it lit at her touch the way the door had, streams of the same layered glyphs cascading across its surface. And this time, without hesitation, without the strange delay of translation, she understood them. Not because she'd learned the language, because some deep, dormant part of her already knew it, the way a body remembers how to swim long after the mind has forgotten being taught. What the console showed her rewrote everything she thought she knew about her own species. Humanity had not clawed its way out of primitive history into an accidental, unlikely spacefaring age, stumbling into contact with civilizations far older and wiser than itself. Humanity, or something that had once called itself humanity, that had built ships like the ones drifting dead in that distant graveyard, that had carved its name into monuments across 100 worlds, had been a founding power of a vast, ancient interstellar civilization, one that predated the Conquered's earliest recorded history by an age Chen's careful scholarly mind visibly struggled to comprehend. And then it had fallen. The records were fragmentary, damaged by time and, Voss suspected, deliberately corrupted by someone determined that they never be fully understood. But the shape of the catastrophe was there, unmistakable even through the gaps, a war, vast and terrible, that had shattered that ancient civilization into scattered, isolated survivors. Survivors stripped of their technology, their history, their very memory of who they had been, left to rebuild from nothing on whatever scraps of world they'd washed up on. One of those worlds was Earth. "We didn't rise," Voss said slowly, the words tasting strange and enormous in her mouth. "We fell, and we forgot we ever had anywhere to fall from." Chen had gone very still, staring at a section of the display that scrolled past dates and names in the ancient script, her academic composure finally cracking. "The Concord's founding charter," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Its oldest members claim to have uplifted a dozen younger species over the millennia, guided them, civilized them." She looked at Voss, eyes wide with the particular horror of someone watching their entire professional understanding of history dissolve in real time. "What if we weren't one of the species they uplifted? What if we were one of the ones they buried?" The console's display shifted as though responding to the question itself, and pulled forward a new fragment, a record older and more damaged than the rest, showing something that might once have been a treaty or a judgment, written partly in the ancient script and partly disturbingly in an early form of Conquered formal language. "Provisional," the document read, in a phrase that survived intact through the corruption, contained, unremembering, "for the safety of all." Voss felt something cold and furious settle in her chest. "They didn't uplift us," she said. "They contained us. The whole classification. Provisional species, too young, too violent. It was never about protecting the galaxy from what we might become. It was about making sure we never remembered what we already were." Overseer Kale Thren arrived at the vault with a strike team twice the size of the one he'd sent to the derelict field, and none of the patience he'd shown before. He had known this day might come since he was young enough to still believe his family's long service to the wardens was a noble inheritance rather than a leash. His bloodline had guarded this particular silence for generations, not because they hated humanity, but because they had inherited, along with the duty, the memory of exactly what happened the last time this cycle reached this point. "Seal the chamber," Thren ordered, stepping through the ruined outer breach into the vault's vast interior, weapon raised toward Voss and Chen, with the flat calm of a man who had done this before and found no satisfaction in it. "Whatever you've read in there, Commander, I promise you understand less than you believe you do." "Then explain it," Voss said, not lowering her own weapon, buying time she wasn't sure existed. Thren's expression, for just a moment, softened into something almost like grief. "This is not the first cycle," he said quietly. "Humanity has stood exactly where you are standing now before, more than once across ages longer than your written history. Each time your people rediscover what you were. Each time you rebuild and reclaim and reach for the stars again with all the ambition and all the appetite for conflict that made the first fall possible in the first place. And each time, it ends the same way." He raised his weapon a fraction higher. "We do not do this because we hate you, Commander Voss. We do this because we have seen how the story ends, and we are trying, in whatever broken way remains to us, to spare the galaxy from watching it happen again." "Then you should have told us that," Voss said, "instead of deciding for us." "Would you have believed me?" She didn't answer, because she genuinely didn't know. Thren's strike team moved to secure the chamber's exits, and Chen, still gripping the last salvageable data core from the console, made a decision Voss would spend the rest of her life being grateful for and terrified by, in equal measure. She threw herself toward a side conduit Voss hadn't even noticed, transmitting the fragment she'd copied off-world through some ancient relay buried in the vault's own architecture, an instant before Thren's team opened fire. The firefight that followed was short, brutal, and cost more than Voss was ready to pay. Chen went down hard, a plasma round catching her shoulder and spinning her into one of the crystalline towers, the data core skittering across the floor as she collapsed. Voss returned fire with a desperation that had nothing tactical left in it, bought 3 seconds of chaos and used them to drag Chen behind the console as the vault's ancient door, responding to some failsafe neither of them had triggered on purpose, began grinding shut, sealing Thren's remaining team outside and Voss and Chen inside together, with a woman bleeding out and an oxygen supply that wouldn't last the day. Thren's voice came through the ceiling gap, almost gentle, almost sorrowful. "This isn't the ending, Commander. It never is. That's what makes it so hard to watch." The door closed with a sound like a held breath finally released, plunging the chamber into a dim emergency glow. And somewhere far above, in the ordinary daylight of a planet that had no idea what had just happened beneath its own solar system, Reyes's inbox lit up with an incoming transmission fragment, corrupted, partial, agonizingly incomplete, carrying the first 2 words of a truth 200 years in the hiding. And across conquered space, in the oldest, quietest ruins on Earth, something that had been sleeping since long before recorded memory felt that fragment ripple outward through channels no living scholar understood, and for the first time in longer than any civilization currently standing had existed, it began slowly to stir. The fragment reached 40 worlds before anyone thought to stop it, and by then it was already too late to matter. Reyes read the corrupted transmission 3 times before he understood what he was holding. A handful of words, a handful of images, degraded almost past recognition, and yet unmistakably real. Ancient ship hulls built from human-grade alloy, a language older than the Concorde itself, a phrase repeated across the fragment like a wound that had never closed, provisional, contained, unremembering. He didn't have the full story. He didn't need it. He had enough to finally ask, in front of the entire assembly, the one question 200 years of patience had never once let him ask: "What did you bury, and why did you bury it in us?" He released the fragment through every neutral channel he could reach before the Concorde's own sensors caught up. Scholarly networks, independent press relays, sympathetic delegations who had quietly doubted the official narrative for years and finally had something solid enough to hold. It spread the way truth spreads once it's finally allowed to move, slowly at first, and then everywhere at once. The assembly convened in chaos. Delegates who had spent 2 centuries treating humanity as a curious, contained experiment now found themselves facing pointed questions from their own citizens about what, exactly, their governments had known, and for how long. Sir Ilvath, for the first time in Reyes's experience, looked less like an arbiter and more like a man watching a structure he'd trusted collapse beneath him. "This is unverified," Ilvath said, though the words carried none of their old certainty. "A fragment, nothing more." "Then verify it," Reyes said. "Send your own investigators into that vault, or explain to every species in this chamber, Why a warden strike team is currently holding 2 human citizens hostage inside it to make sure no one ever does. That was the moment the vote turned, and Reyes felt it happen the way sailors feel a wind shift before a storm. Not a single dramatic gesture, but a slow, cascading realization moving delegate to delegate that the story they had all agreed to believe for 200 years might have been built on someone else's carefully maintained silence. Earth's provisional government did not wait for the vote to finish. Within the hour, under authority no treaty technically granted them, they issued an order that hadn't been given in 2 centuries: full, unrestricted mobilization of the Terran Defense Fleet. Every ship humanity had, every crew, aimed at a single set of coordinates in their own asteroid belt. And for the first time since first contact, humanity was not asking the Concorde's permission to defend its own, herself, that they had much time left. Chen lay propped against the base of the console, pale from blood loss, her breathing shallow but steady, conscious just enough to keep gripping Voss's hand like it was the only fixed point in a world that had stopped making sense. "You should have left me on the derelict," she murmured, only half joking. "Saved yourself a trip." "Shut up," Voss said, without heat, and kept working the console with hands that were starting to shake from more than cold. She didn't fully understand what she was doing. She understood only that the console responded to something in her that wasn't training or knowledge. Some older instinct, some inherited fluency she hadn't known she carried, guiding her hands toward controls that made no logical sense and worked anyway. Layer after layer of the vault's ancient systems came awake around her, humming louder, brighter, as though her presence alone were enough to remind it what it was for. "Elena." Chen's voice had gone very quiet. "What are you doing?" "I don't know," Voss admitted. "But it knows me. Whatever this place is, whatever I apparently am, and it's not fighting me, it's waiting for me." The console's final layer resolved beneath her palms into something that felt less like a machine and more like a held breath finally about to be released. A failsafe, ancient and patient, built by people who had understood, even as their civilization fell, that someday someone would come back desperate enough and determined enough, and united enough to deserve what they'd left behind. Outside, the vault shuddered as the first shockwave of the Terran fleet's arrival rippled through the asteroid field. Thren watched Earth's fleet emerge from the dark in numbers that made his tactical readout flicker with disbelief. Ship after ship after ship, more than his intelligence reports had ever suggested Earth possessed, arriving not in the cautious, apologetic formation of a species asking for mercy, but in the hard, deliberate lines of a species that had finally decided it no longer needed anyone's approval to defend what was its own. "Sir," Ryzek said, voice tight. "Orders?" Thren looked at the fleet, at the vault sealed beneath them holding 2 of the very people that fleet had come to reclaim, and felt something in him, some old, tired certainty he'd inherited along with his rank, finally begin to crack. He had spent his whole career believing he was preventing a catastrophe. Watching humanity arrive like this, uninvited and unstoppable and entirely unwilling to be denied, he understood for the first time that he might simply have been delaying one. "Hold position," he said. "Do not fire first." They fired anyway, not Thren's ships but a second warden contingent arriving late, unaware of Thren's hesitation, opening on the Terran fleet the moment it came into range. What followed was not the clean, one-sided defeat any conquered tactician would have predicted. Human ships, technologically outmatched on every individual spec, fought with a coordination and a ferocity that came from something no simulation could model. Pilots who had trained their entire careers under the assumption that they would always be the smaller force, always the underdog, and had built an entire doctrine around making that disadvantage irrelevant. They took losses. Real ones, painful ones. And they did not break. Thren watched his own superior technology falter against tactics too unpredictable to counter, watched formation after formation of warden ships get drawn into traps built from bluffs and sacrifice plays and a willingness to risk everything that his own forces, for all their advantages, simply did not share. And in the wreckage of his certainty, he made the only choice left to a man who had spent his life believing he was the last line of defense against a story he could no longer stop. Then no one gets what's inside, he said quietly, and gave the order to detonate the vault. The countdown began the instant the order reached the vault's outer systems, and Voss felt it the way you feel a held breath about to break. A deep structural shudder running through the crystalline towers around her. Red light spilling across the console in place of the calm blue-white glow that had guided her hands moments before. Elena. Chen's grip on her hand tightened, weak but urgent. Elena, what is that? Self-destruct, Voss said, and made herself say it steadily for Chen's sake more than her own. Thren's not letting anyone walk out of here with what we found. She looked at the countdown scrolling across the console in the ancient script, numbers falling with the same terrible patience as the signal that had started all of this in that distant graveyard, and understood, with a strange calm settling over her fear, that she had exactly one chance to prove that whatever her ancestors had once been, she was still enough of it to matter. Above them, muffled through the vault's ancient stone, the battle raged on, human ships bleeding and burning and refusing to retreat, a species finally, fully, unmistakably done asking permission to exist. And far beyond the asteroid field, in the old dark soil of a planet none of the fighting ships could see from here, something ancient that had felt the first fragment ripple through its dormant systems now felt this second, greater surge, desperation, unity, sacrifice, exactly the signature it had been built, millennia ago, to wait for, and it finally, after longer than any living being could measure, began to move. The thing that arrived in the system was not a weapon, though for 3 terrible seconds everyone watching believed it was. It came out of the dark faster than anything the Concord sensors had a category for. A shape both ship and something older than the word ship implied. Its hull etched with the same layered glyphs Voss had read on the derelict, on the vault door, on the console beneath her shaking hands, vast, silent, and utterly unbothered by the battle raging around the asteroid field. Warden gunners locked onto it on reflex and found their targeting system simply refusing to engage, as though the object itself had reached out and gently, firmly, closed their hands. It did not attack. It did not need to. It unfolded around the edges of the battle like a held breath finally released, and where its light touched Warden weapons fire meant for human hulls, the fire simply stopped mattering, absorbed, redirected, dissolved into something that looked, to the humans watching in stunned silence from their cockpits, uncomfortably like being protected by something that had been waiting an unbearably long time for the chance. Inside the vault, the self-destruct countdown reached its final seconds, and Voss had run out of ideas, out of leverage, out of anything except the stubborn refusal to let go of Chen's hand. Then the countdown simply stopped, not slowed, not overridden by anything Voss had done. It simply stopped, the ancient system's red warning light easing back to the calm blue-white it had worn before, and a presence moved through the chamber that Voss felt more than saw, vast and old and impossibly gentle, settling over the vault the way a hand settles over a child who has finally stopped crying. The vault door, sealed since Thren's ambush, opened without resistance. Standing in the breach where Thren's strike team had been was nothing at all. No soldiers, no weapons, only that same soft light spilling in from outside, and beyond it, through the ruined outer shell of the asteroid, Voss could see it. The ancient vessel, close enough now to fill the whole sky, its presence utterly unlike anything the Concord had ever catalogued, radiating something that felt, absurdly, like relief. "It's not here to fight," Chen breathed, staring up at it with tears cutting clean tracks through the blood and dust on her face. "Elena, it's not a weapon. I think it's family." The battle ended not in surrender, but in silence. Warden ships falling back, weapons lowering, as crew after crew watched their targeting systems refuse to engage a vessel that radiated no hostility at all, only a vast and ancient patience that made continued violence feel suddenly, unbearably small. Thren stood on his own bridge and watched the ancient ship settle into a slow, protective orbit around the asteroid field, shielding the human fleet without ever firing a shot, and felt the last of his family's long, exhausting certainty finally give way. He had spent his whole life believing he was the only thing standing between the galaxy and a catastrophe. Watching this, watching humanity's oldest inheritance return not with vengeance but with something closer to grief and welcome. He understood, too late to have done anything differently, that he had spent his life guarding against the wrong ending. He gave the order to stand down. It was the only order left that still meant anything. The assembly reconvened 4 days later, and this time Reyes did not sit silently in the chair reserved for a single silent observer. The recovered records from the vault, verified now independently by conquered scholars who could no longer credibly dismiss them, told a story 200 years of careful narrative had been built to prevent anyone from asking about. Humanity as a founding people of a civilization older than the Concord itself, fallen not through weakness, but through catastrophe, deliberately kept unremembering by descendants of the very forces who had once feared what they might become again. Sir Ilvath, stripped of the easy authority that had once let the Assembly's decisions pass unquestioned, offered what might, in conquered terms, have counted as an apology, a formal acknowledgement of historical oversight, an offer of expanded provisional rights, a gesture toward eventual reconsideration of Earth status pending further review. Reyes listened to the whole careful, hedged, face-saving proposal, and then, for the first time in 30 years of patient diplomacy, said no. "You don't get to grant us anything," he said, and the chamber, for once, was entirely silent. We were never provisional. We were never young or primitive or something to be graciously uplifted. We built ships that still fly, millennia after your oldest civilizations learned to write. We fell, and instead of being helped back up, we were buried, quietly, patiently, generation after generation, because someone decided it was safer to keep us small than to find out what we'd become if we ever remembered ourselves. He let that settle before he continued, quieter now, but no less certain. We're not asking for provisional status. We're not asking for a review. We are informing this assembly that Earth is a founding tier civilization, and that as of today, we intend to be treated as one. No one voted against him. No one, this time, dared to. Voss stood at the vault's threshold weeks later, the ancient ship still holding its slow orbit overhead, visible now from Earth's own night sky as a new, steady point of light that had already found its way into 100 children's drawings and 1,000 hopeful songs. Chen, her shoulder healing, her academic caution finally giving way to something closer to wonder, stood beside her with a data slate full of records that would occupy scholars for the rest of both their lifetimes. "You know they're going to want you back at the academy," Chen said. "Teaching this time, not flying recon." "I know. You don't sound thrilled." Voss looked up at the ancient light in the sky, at the shape of a legacy she was still only beginning to understand, and thought about the word the vault had spoken to her, that first day, in a voice built for a throat that had been human, and something more than human at once. She still hadn't told anyone what it meant. She wasn't sure she needed to. Some things belonged to the people who had earned them, not to committees and assemblies and careful diplomatic phrasing. "I keep thinking about what Thren said," she admitted, "that this had happened before, that every time we get here we reach for the stars with the same hunger that broke us the first time." She let out a slow breath. Maybe he wasn't wrong to be afraid. Maybe not, Chen agreed, but he was wrong about what to do with that fear. You don't keep a species safe by making sure it never remembers who it is. You keep it safe by trusting it to carry that memory better the second time. Voss thought about the battle, about human pilots who had refused to break even against impossible odds, about Reyes standing alone in a chamber that had ignored him for 30 years, and finally being heard, about an ancient ship that had waited millennia not to conquer on humanity's behalf, but simply to stand beside them the moment they proved, through unity, rather than force, that they deserved to remember. "No," she said finally, something settling and certain in her chest for the first time since this had all begun. "We're not the same as we were. We never needed anyone's permission to be what we already were all along. We just needed to remember it." She looked up once more at the steady, ancient light, watching over the world below, and turned back toward the ship waiting to carry her home. Not as a provisional guest of someone else's galaxy, but as what humanity had always, quietly, patiently, been the entire time. They had never needed to ask for the stars. They had only ever needed to remember they were already theirs.